enormous pleasure for me to introduce today my dear and admired colleague, Johanna Pink. Although I'm sure that anybody present in this meeting here knows her better than I do. And you do so not only because she's the organizer of this lecture series on translation, but mainly as an internationally renowned scholar. So to be brief, Johanna is full professor for Islamic studies in Freiburg, after having held positions in the most prestigious universities of Germany, I would say, namely Bonn, where she did PhD, Tübingen, Freie Universität Berlin. Johanna's special field of research is the Quran interpretation, and if I understand it well, the plurality of interpretation and practices of Quran. And also she did her PhD thesis on communities in Egypt. She has become widely interested about Muslim practicing beyond the Arabic world. Now, translation is maybe the most evident manifestation of intercultural or transnational transfer of the Quran. So it's quite logical that Johanna has become the initiator and director of the ERC research project, the Global Quran, which is mainly concerned with translations of the Quran. So this means that we couldn't find a better specialist for the topic of today's lecture. Let me add also that Johanna has been recently the leader, the instigator, the director of the big research project we submitted to the Excellence Initiative here, which didn't succeed, but we will follow with this. So this was called DeColoniality Now. So we see that from her reflection on the Quran, she also developed into a specialist of postcolonial aspects in cultural science. So go ahead, Johanna. We are looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I'm going to share my presentation. I'm not actually working in translation studies, but what brought me to asking questions about translation is my work on first Quranic exegesis and then Quran translation. As Daniel said, I was interested in how people who speak different languages interpret the Quran and whether there's any difference that is actually dependent on language and not just on belonging to a different school of interpretation or things like that. And then I also came to realize that the very term or concept of translation is incredibly contested when we look at the Quran, because people have come to think that it means something that most Muslims don't want to associate with the Quran. And I'm going to try and explain very briefly what I mean here. So Muslims have actually engaged with the Quran in languages other than Arabic for at least 1,000 years and probably longer. We have things like you can see here, these are examples from the Ottoman Empire, from the Malay world, and from the Persian-speaking regions, which were far broader historically than today's Iran. And you can see in all these examples, even if you don't read Arabic, there's always a certain presence of the Arabic source text, not only because all the languages in which the Quran was explained or translated, whatever you want to call it, also used the Arabic alphabet, but there was always a portion of the Arabic text itself. In the example on the left, these are the bits with the yellow lines above. So in classical Arabic, you didn't underline, you overlined words to emphasize them. In the text in the middle, they are highlighted in red, and on the right side, the Arabic Quran is the big writing, and then between the lines, you have short explanations of works in Persian. So usually you had like paraphrastic translations that were paraphrasing the text in a different language, or you had interlinear translations that were explaining individual words from the Arabic text, or you had things like on the left, more like a commentary and even a meta commentary. And none of these things are really what we think of when we say translation today. And the same is true for most Muslims today. And this is because of a monumental change that took place across the world, I would say, in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, where specific modern European way of translating texts pretty much came to dominate everything and also dominate globally the understanding of what we mean when we say translation. This is something that has been expressed in a classic in the field of translation studies, Lawrence Venuti's The Translators and Invisibility, which is also the cue for the title of my talk. So the paradigm of the invisible translator denotes a development in Europe where the role of the translator and the things that the translator inscribes into the text are masked. So the translator produces a text in the target language that is a standalone text. You can read it without any reference to the source text. It is fluent, so it doesn't try to give a word-for-word rendering of the source text. It's fluent in the grammar and syntax and so on of the target language. And it tries to erase the voice of the translator and come across as an objective rendering of the source text, which you can see when you buy a Bible, for example. You will buy a German language book, it says Die Bibel, and people will usually take it to be the Bible, even though none of these texts were originally written in German. And this is what I mean when I talk of the invisible translator paradigm. And it's from the outset very often been considered problematic by a lot of Muslims when Muslims started using it in order to translate the Quran, is when they especially started doing so when they translated the Quran into European languages at the beginning of the 20th century. I would say it started in British India in 1905 with the first English Quran translation done by a Muslim, which was modeled after the translations done by European Orientalists. So it was an English-only book that you could read without any reference to the Arabic Quran. And that was a novel way of doing things, although Quran translations themselves were already very pervasive in British India at the time. And there were a lot of debates about whether this is even permissible and whether you can call it a translation and so on among Muslims. It was still very successful for a lot of reasons, partly because it was, so here you can see one of these translations. So partly because it was meant to counter the activity of Christian missionaries who were spreading their version of what the Quran meant and why it was wrong, obviously. So Muslims were looking for resources to counter these arguments. There was also in many countries, not just in British India, an increasing number of educated Muslims who had gone to colonial schools and who lacked a traditional Islamic education. And so they had no resources to actually engage with the Quran in Arabic. They often couldn't even read the Arabic script. And this also became a thing when more and more languages changed their script from Arabic to typically Latin, but also Cyrillic script. So this was also a major reason why people were looking for this new genre of translation, because as soon as you had a different script, which was not Arabic script, it was also much harder to do these traditional forms where the Arabic text and the explanation or translation were used interchangeably and in one go, especially with the possibilities of typesetting that people had at the time. So very often it was just easier to do a monolingual English text than to try and do something like an interlinear translation. And so here you can see this is a very famous English Quran translation that emerged in British India that was published in 1917 in England. We have the Arabic Quran, and separated from it we have the English translation as a fluent standalone text. You can read it without referring to the Arabic without any problems. You have some explanations of literal meanings or alternative translations, but they are clearly separated from what the translator considers the translation proper. And then you have a lot of annotation, but that's relegated to the footnotes. So you can also, you have the impression that this English standalone text is the neutral objective meaning of the Quran. And if you're looking for the translator's opinion, you find it in these other segments, but not in the translation itself. And so my aim is to trace this development towards these would-be invisible translators, and also the development away from it that I think we can see in recent decades. And in the process of tracing this development, what I would really like to do is to make visible these invisible translators in two senses. First of all, as the persons producing these translations. Who were they, what drove them, what motivated them, and so on. And also the traces of these translators in the text. What did they actually do? Where can we see their impact on the translation? Where do they become visible in the translation? I was very inspired by this book, which is also by now a classic in translation studies by Maria Chemotsko, Enlarging Translation, Empowering Translators. And she also argues very vehemently for an approach to translation studies where different practices of translating texts that are prevalent or used to be prevalent in different cultures are taken seriously and are all considered to be part of translation, instead of reducing our understanding of translation to a very specific genre of text production that comes basically from Europe. Okay, and so, I mean, because in this talk, I obviously don't have 12 hours or something, which I could probably easily fill, but I will spare you. And I will instead try to focus on mostly one story and then an additional one that is kind of a contrast to it, to illuminate a bit like what I'm trying to do. And the story that I'm going to start with is the story of this person, Omar Ba, intellectual from West Africa, who lived from 1917 to 1998, and who is the author of the very first, I would say, modern Quran translation, in the sense of what I was just talking about, this invisible translator genre, into a language he called Peul. I think the quality of the image is not that great, but it says Le Coran Français Peul. So it's a bilingual translation. It's into French and Peul is the French term for something that is also called Pular. It's a variant of the Fulfulde language, or Fulani, as it's called in Arabic. It has a preface by Leopold Sédar Senghor, a Catholic Christian who was the first president of Senegal, and it's really a very, very fascinating document of the contradictions and ambivalences of the early post-colonial period in West Africa. So the introduction is from 1970. So by this point, the translation project must already have been underway, but it was only published in the early 1980s. Omar Ba was born in a region called Fouta Toro, which is situated at the middle run of the Senegal River. And these Fouta Toro and the territories north of it were only conquered by the French and added to this colonial entity of French West Africa around 1900, so fairly late. Omar's father was a Qadi, a Muslim judge, and Omar also initially as a boy received a traditional Islamic education. But then when he was around 9 years old, the village elder decided that he should enter the colonial school system because he was apparently a quick learner. And his father was actually not that thrilled because he wanted him to become a classical Islamic scholar like himself. But apparently the village elder had the last word. And so Omar was sent to Port-Louis, the former capital of French West Africa, where there was a school that had originally been founded in the 19th century as a kind of hostage school. So the French were taking the sons of local chieftains hostages and sending them to this school to forcibly civilize them and also to have leverage against these chieftains. By the 1930s, when Omar went there, its purpose was, I mean, people came there of their own accord because their parents or village elders or whatever thought they needed someone with a modern education, as was the case with Omar. So he then had a very typical colonial career. He worked in a lot of functions in West Africa as a teacher, school inspector for the postal and telegraph service, as a columnist for a newspaper. So anything you could do when you were literate in French, basically, at this time. And most of these appointments actually took place within the boundaries of what is today Senegal, but there were also some stints in Paris, in Togo, and in what is today Mauritania. But then something interesting happened, which also tells us a lot about the dynamics of the compartmentalization of Africa in the towards the end of the colonial period, because the French decided to release French West Africa into independence. First of all, in 1958, they made like a kind of last-ditch effort to prevent the loss of these colonies by turning them into semi-independent protectorates within the borders of the administrative units that the French had defined. And one of these borders was the Senegal River. So the region of Fouta Toro was just bam, cut in half. It didn't matter that it was a historical unit that had rulers and traditions, etc. The southern part became part of Senegal, and the northern part became part of Mauritania. And suddenly Omar Ba, because he was born a few hundred meters north of the Senegal River, became a Mauritanian, which was kind of a problem because Mauritania was a country that tried to identify as mostly Arab after independence. So their way of like settling all these identity problems that arose after these countries gained independence was very much by emphasizing the Arab and Berber identity, which was the majority of the population. And most of the minorities came from the south, like Omar Ba's group. They were black, or at least they were considered black by the Arab and Berber population. And they also had a history of being enslaved by the Arab and Berber population. And as a matter of fact, by the time Mauritania became independent, slavery was still very much legal. So this was a lot of, there were a lot of problems involved in this, but he became a Mauritanian. There was no debate about it. And oops, why did it end my presentation? So I didn't want to do this. Omar was now classified as Mauritanian, and this also meant that his language became a minority language everywhere, because there was no single country in Africa where the Fula speakers were majority. There were a lot of Fula speakers. It's a very large language group, but they became a minority in every single country, including Senegal and Mauritania. These countries had vastly different language policies. Senegal was a lot more liberal than Mauritania, but there were a lot of struggles going on in the 1960s and 1970s over the role of all these languages that were spoken in West Africa. For example, in broadcasting, do we get slots for having full broadcasting and radio programs? What's the role of these languages in schooling and so on? And this is obviously also the backdrop against which he decided to do this Qur'an translation, because just as was the case in Europe with regard to biblical translation, Qur'an translations were a vehicle to elevate the status of a language. So you could make the point that this is a modern language, this is a literary language, and that's why it needs some kind of official status. That's why we need to teach it to children and so on. And the fact that it was a traditional language of Islamic learning wasn't enough anymore. And you can see this very much in this Quran translation. It's completely different from any traditional form of translating and interpreting the Quran that we have in West Africa, starting with the script, which is Latin script. All the previous translations of the Quran had been written in Arabic script, and they had usually been framed as commentaries written by scholars. But Omar Ba chose the Latin script, and actually in his introduction, Leopold Sédar Senghor explicitly says that by doing so, he has transported the Quran to modernity. So the very question of script was also a question of modernity, of being modern. So as you can see here, there's no Arabic text in this book. There's just the French and the Polar version. And the French version is actually mostly plagiarized from the Orientalist Régis Blachère. It's like mostly word for word Régis Blachère, with a very few exceptions that I will spare you because they are only really interesting to specialists in Islamic studies. But basically, yeah, he took the work of this French Orientalist and he plagiarized it. And interestingly, it has been mentioned in some of the literature on Islam in West Africa, and usually there's just one sentence on it that says it's not interesting because the Polar translation is just a copy of the French one. It's not original. So this is so interesting, first in framing the very act of translating as not original, and in assuming that you can just take the French and transport it to Polar, and then it's still the same text, so it's not original. And also because it's simply not true. So obviously all of these people have not really looked at the text of the translation. Because if you do so, you see that in a lot of places, such as this one, which is just an example, and I won't go into too much detail here, because again, this is mostly probably interesting for specialists in Quranic studies, but in a lot of instances, the French translator Régis Blachère, who was an Orientalist, who was not indebted to Muslim traditions of interpreting the Quran, chose his own version of what certain terms in the Quran meant that was in conflict with common Muslim understanding of what this term might mean. And in these cases, Omar Ba very often, he left the French alone, but he translated the full folder differently. For example, in this case, this is Surah 103. It's in Arabic, it's called Surat al-Asr, and al-Asr can mean a lot of different things. It can mean a certain time of the day, the late afternoon, but it can also mean an age, like a period of time. And there's a lot of debates in Muslim Quranic commentaries over what it actually means that this surah starts with an oath that evokes this term. There's no consensus at all. But Régis Blachère chose to translate it as par le destin, by destiny. And this is like a completely unusual interpretation. It's not present in the Muslim Quranic commentaries. So Omar Ba actually placed an alternative translation in brackets behind it. And he also only translated this alternative translation into full folder. And you can also see, even in this excerpt, even if you don't read these languages, the full folder version is shorter. So he kind of kept out all of Régis Blachère's editorial comments and actually, yeah, tried to stick very closely to the wording of the Quran. This translation is really, it's super interesting to me because it's so deeply ambivalent. You can see on the one hand, there was this desire to revive a local language, and Omar Ba, this was Omar Ba's entire project. He did a PhD at the Sorbonne on the Polar or Futa Toro, and he wrote dictionaries, he wrote all kinds of things about this culture and this language. He wrote poetry in this language, and the Quran translation was just part of this project of preserving this culture, which he clearly understood as Muslim, but not only Muslim. It also had a specific language. It had specific ways of, I don't know, describing plants and animals and all kinds of things. But at the same time, he felt that he needed to use a European model of doing this. So he used European genres of writing. He used a European script. And as I said, this was also emphasized in the foreword by Senghor, who said, and I quote, "By translating the Quran into Fula, Omar Ba is only continuing, developing, and modernizing a specifically Senegalese religious tradition. Here, as elsewhere, people have felt, since the introduction of Islam, which dates back several centuries, the need to not only explain the Quran and comment on it, but also to translate it into vernacular languages. Omar Ba has done no more than transcribe into the Latin, that is to say modern, script, something that had previously been oral." So, and yeah, besides the issue of script that I've already gone into, the other thing that's interesting is that he implicitly also frames a written translation as more modern than an oral translation. And indeed, like the bulk of the interpretive tradition of this region and a lot of regions in the Muslim world was oral and not written. And if we have written translations, it's usually just a transcript of oral lessons that some teacher or preacher gave at some time. And of course, a written text has a completely different nature. So instead of something that is fluid, that can change from session to session, that is clearly spoken by a person who might also change their opinion or expand their knowledge of this topic at some point. You have something that is fixed, that is static. And that also lends itself to this notion of translation, where you think, okay, I have a static text, so I can provide an exact translation of it that is equally static. Yeah, so this is something that happened really across the Muslim world. We have this in many regions, but it's not the only story we can tell. And we have another part of the story, and that's the continuing life of the old and traditional forms of translation, which have also often been modernized, but still tie in with the way Muslims have taught and explained and preached about the Quran before colonization. And so this is my second example. It's the story of a translation from a quite different region of the world, Indonesia, or to be more precise, Java. The translator, or exegete as he called himself, is called Bisri Mustafa. Although, I mean, this translation versus exegesis, it's also a bit ambivalent, because you can see here on the picture, you can see two versions of his Quranic commentary or translation. The left one, and they are both the same language, Javanese, but the left one is in Arabic script, which is called Pagon in Java, and the right one is in Latin script. So the Arabic script says tafsir, which is a Quranic commentary. It's a term that's often used to avoid all the implications of saying I translated the Quran, which a lot of Muslims object to. But on the right, in Latin script, you can see that it's called terjemah al-Quran, and terjemah is precisely the term for translation. So here, even with the change of script, you can see that there's also a change in terminology, and that there's more readiness when using the European, like the Latin script, to acknowledge that this is actually a translation. So here it's important to know the context. I mean, everywhere it's important to know the context, but this specific context is a context of a pesantren. A pesantren is a traditional boarding school, an Islamic boarding school that's very common in villages, especially on Java. So children are sent there to study with a head teacher, a kiai, and traditionally the study of Quranic interpretation wasn't really a central part of the curriculum. So the central parts were usually, first of all, learning classical Arabic, and then also Islamic law, and to a certain extent theology. But along with Muslim modernism, there also came a growing trend towards emphasizing the role of the Quran, and not only the role of the Quran in terms of ritual, like reciting the Quran and so on, but also the role of understanding the Quran. And so there were some pesantrens that conformed to this new centrality of the Quran, and Bisri Mustafa was one of them. So he started teaching the Quran in the pesantren. He was heading in central Java in Rembang. He first published this translation, commentary, whatever. I'm going to say a bit more about what it actually is in a moment, in 1959. And because he's a quite famous scholar, and he has a son who is even more famous in Indonesia today, Mustafa Bisri, so it's basically the same name, but the other way around. Also known as Gus Mus. He's a very well-known scholar associated with the Nahdlatul Ulama, one of the religious mass organizations in Indonesia that mostly emphasize traditional scholarship and also Sufism, Islamic mysticism. And so because he and his son are so famous, this also in a way ensured the lasting fame of his work. You can see this from the fact that this glossy Latin script version with gilded writing, etc., was published in 2011. So originally what this is actually a kitab kuning. Kitab kuning means yellow book in Indonesian, and it comes from the very cheap yellowish paper that these textbooks for schools were published on originally in the 19th and early 20th century. And it's quite funny because you can see that in this edition in Pagon script, they just dyed the edges of the page yellow to make it a yellow book, even though the paper is not actually all that bad anymore, but it needs to conform to this kind of model. But as you can also see from the gilded version, it has become much more of this. And by the way, you can even look at teaching sessions where his son teaches this orally in the Pesantren on YouTube today. So we have all kinds of versions of this tafsir or translation, whatever. So, I mean, a lot of Indonesians I've talked to about this have told me this is not a translation, it's a tafsir, that is a commentary on the Quran. But I keep wondering about that, because what does he do? So first of all, we have this box at the inner margin of the page on the left, upper left on this page, and it has the Arabic text of the Quran, and then it has an interlinear translation, like I showed in the beginning for Persian. But in this case, it's an interlinear translation that follows a very specific format. It's also called gandul in Javanese because it's kind of hanging from the Arabic words, below the Arabic words. And it doesn't only contain the meaning of words, but it also contains grammatical and syntactical information. So for example, it says, it means this and it's a predicate of the sentence, or it means this and it's a noun, or it's the referent of this pronoun or whatever. So there's a very specific terminology, and some former Pesantren students have told me that it took them years to actually understand what was going on when they were being taught the Quran this way. So then you have a kind of paraphrastic translation. So it's the meaning of the verse is rendered, but in the exegete's own words. So it's clearly not an attempt to do an exact translation of the Arabic text, but it's more like, I'm going to tell you about it on the part of the exegete. And then you have some additional elements which are clearly marked. For example, here you have something that is marked as qissa, story, and then you have tanbih, which is kind of an additional remark. So it's actually very clearly structured. And yeah, in a way, so when you look at, for example, this, I try to break down what this gandul part actually does. So it's probably too much to ask that you take in this complicated table and like while I'm talking about it for a couple of minutes, but you can see here that for every word you get some very intricate information that really explains, like word for word, the meaning, the grammar, the position in the sentence. And it's the attempt to do justice to the source text and to enable students to understand the source text. And then when you look at the paraphrase, whereas the previous thing really sticks super closely to the source text, there's no extra interpretive commentary at all. Whereas in the paraphrastic part, you can see, so I've just taken a random verse to give you an example. And on the left, you can see more or less literal translation that at least tries to stick close to the Arabic source text. It's a verse from the story of Joseph, the Hebrew Bible Joseph in the Quran. And you can see immediately, even without going into the details of the text, that the paraphrastic translation given by the Javanese translator is much longer. So he gives more details. He doesn't give a lot of commentary necessarily. He doesn't go into exegetical intricacies or something, but for example, he identifies the speaker. So in the Arabic Quran, you very often have qala, qala, qala. He said, he said, he said. And you have to deduce from context who actually said what. And sometimes it's not even clear. Exegetes are discussing, like, is it him or is it God or is it whatever? So this is something that, for example, traditional translators very typically insert to make it easier for their audience to understand what's actually going on. So it's the prophet Jacob spoke. And then he says, who is he speaking to? Son. So it's, in this case, it's the older brother of Joseph who's asking, like, could we take our younger brother with us? Ha, ha, ha. We just want to give him a good time. And then they drop him into this pit and so on. It's this whole story. So he's just more extensive, not really in order to provide a lot of exegesis, but in order to make the text comprehensible for the listeners. So I'm worried because I'm concerned that Joseph might be eaten by a wild dog. This is quite funny. One Japanese translation actually has tiger for this. In the Arabic, it's a wolf, like in the Bible. But well, there are not that many wolves in Java, so this one has a wild dog and another one has a tiger. Anyway, so you get the idea of what he's doing. And actually, when I started working on this, and the first paper I wrote on it, to my shame, I have to admit that I had never heard of Venuti at this point, because as I said, I'm not coming from translation studies at all. So this was the title I gave to this article, The Kiai's Voice and the Arabic Quran. And the argument is actually a lot similar to this idea of having visible or invisible translators. But in this case, the metaphor it chose was not a visual one, but an oral one, the voice and not the visibility. And I think it's significant because in this setting, as in West Africa, traditionally, the translator is a preacher or a teacher, someone who communicates orally. And the written text is secondary to that. And even when you have the written text, like in this case of Al-Ibris, you hear the translator speaking. It's really written as if he is telling the story to a bunch of children, which he did. This is exactly what this text is doing. So the question is this not a translation? And I actually think it's, I mean, the translation studies have fortunately mostly gone beyond this paradigm of faithfulness. But if you want to talk about faithfulness, I think it's actually pretty faithful, or at least sincere, because it's absolutely clear what the translator is doing in each part of this translation. And it's also absolutely clear where his voice belongs and where it doesn't belong. So you have this grammatical part and his voice doesn't really belong in there. It's still in there, obviously, because very often he has to choose from different possible meanings and so on. But it's clear that this is not the focus to provide some kind of, you know, metaphorical interpretation or something. And then you have this other part, the paraphrastic translation and the additional remarks, where it's totally okay and expected and also transparent that this is the translator speaking, because you can practically hear him speaking when you read this. What am I getting at with all this? Oh yeah, just one thing I should mention on the Indonesian context. Obviously, even there we have the invisible translator paradigm, which has mostly arrived there from British India. So you can see a lot of translations that are very different, very similar in format to the kind of translation that I showed in the beginning that emerged in British India, with footnotes, for example, which Islamic texts just didn't do. They usually had their commentary in the margins. And this column style layout, and on the right you can see the translation by the Indonesian Ministry of Religious Affairs, which was first published in the 1960s, and like it completely adopted this layout. Yeah, so we have multiple ways of translation, as we have multiple modernities and so on. And one of the reasons I think for which we also have such a big difference between what Omar Ba was doing and what Bisri Mustafa was doing is also because their lives and careers were disrupted or not disrupted by colonialism in very different ways. So in the case of Bisri Mustafa, I think there was relatively little disruption. I mean, it's impossible to say that there was no disruption because there was always disruption, obviously, but he could continue doing what he was doing, teaching children in his Islamic boarding school. And that's why he could also continue in his traditional language. He continued doing it in Javanese even after the Republic of Indonesia was founded and the official language became Indonesian. And that's why he could also continue working in this traditional format. Whereas for Omar Ba, with all his like education and so on, it was simply not an option. Actually, in the 1990s, when he was already like, I don't know, 70, in his 70s or 80s, he went to Saudi Arabia to properly study Arabic, because obviously he felt that this was lacking. So a lot more disruption, and also in the way that nation-state borders were installed in West Africa. So when I'm going back to Fulfulde, and this leads me to the conclusion, we also see that there are more recent attempts to translate the Quran in this language, and also much more widespread and popular ones than Omar's Ba translation, which is today actually quite hard to get and not very widespread. This one, for example, was published by the King Fahd Complex in Medina, Saudi Arabia. And you can see, first of all, it's in Arabic script, which is not the only version. They also have a version in Latin script. So they do both, which I find very interesting, serving different target groups who have received different types of education. You can also see, without being able to read the script, that obviously the translation is a lot longer than the original. So it's more of a commentary than a word-for-word translation, which also goes, yeah, it's kind of a return to traditional ways of translating the Quran. Yeah, if you really look at the details, you will also see that there's a lot more Arabic vocabulary in the Fulfulde part, which actually matches the usage of the language in religious contexts in West Africa. But Omar Ba, for example, tried to avoid it because his translation was so much part of language activism, and language activists usually go for a purist version of their language, even if that makes the translation less intelligible to the actual speakers, who do use loan words all the time in the way they speak. So, but this is just a side note. Another thing I would like to remark is that we see a return of the interlinear translation in a lot of settings. And this, interestingly, is German. It's a context where we don't have any history of Islamic schooling, although of course, we have a lot of people in Germany who come from, like, or whose parents or grandparents come from countries in which we do have such a history. This is helped, of course, by the possibilities of computer-aided typesetting. And I do think it's interesting because it points to an increasing interest in actually engaging with the source text of the Quran while reading the translation, and which, instead of just taking a standalone text, which is also present in this interlinear translation, if you look at the margin. So in conclusion, the question I was asking myself is whether I'm being judgmental, and if it's justified. So do I see the invisible translator paradigm as a bad thing? Like, it's a colonial concept, etc., etc. On the one hand, no, it does have its advantages, and there's a reason for its popularity. Like I said, there was a big demand in British India, for example, or in colonial Indonesia. A lot of people found this genre accessible, more accessible than the traditional forms, especially people who hadn't received any traditional Islamic education. For many people, it gave them a means to access the meaning of their holy book. And even there were a lot of converts who came to embrace Islam through being confronted with a Quran translation into English, for example. And even some very staunch opponents of Quran translation, like Muhammad Rashid Rida in Egypt, came around and saw that there were these converts and that maybe it wasn't such a bad thing to have these translations. But then what we can also see is that the invisible translator paradigm is a problem because it's simply, it has marginalized or even extinguished other practices that might also have their uses and also have their practical purposes. And this is an example I just very recently came across. This was a guy from Saudi Arabia, like an engineer or something, who translated the Quran into English because he felt that all the existing translations were wrong because they weren't closely following the Arabic text. And if you look at this English translation, I won't go into any details because I don't want to go over time too much and so on, but anyway, you see, it's completely impenetrable. I mean, who can even make sense of this? Like all these superscript letters, which are supposed to denote like this is a plural and this is female in Arabic and whatnot, and all the Arabic words he has in there because he thinks they are untranslatable, and then he still translates them in brackets, etc. And this guy was obviously completely ignorant of the fact that there is a traditional genre that tries to accomplish what he's trying to accomplish, namely the interlinear translation, which I just showed you, which is exactly the right genre for people who want to understand every single word of the Arabic text. And it's so much less confusing than what this guy is doing. But because he's lacking this historical knowledge, he's also lacking the means of actually doing this in a way that would be useful to anyone. So this is one of the problems. And the second problem is people just buy into this paradigm. That is, we see many cases of people who actually believe that the translation is the Quran. And I see that I have a lot of Indonesians in the audience, and you are all familiar, very familiar with this case. It was a big political scandal that started in 2016 when a Christian was running for the gubernatorial elections in Jakarta. And he got into a big row over a Quranic verse, Quran 551, which says, "La tattakhidhul yahuda wan nasara awliya," so don't take the Jews and Christians awliya. And in a lot of Indonesian translations, including the first editions of the translation by the Indonesian Ministry of Religion, this word awliya was translated as leaders. Don't take the Jews and Christians leaders. Now, this translation actually comes from the colonial context. It was clearly used by translators and exegetes at this point as an injunction against collaborating with the Dutch. And it carried on into the post-colonial period. And then people were weaponizing this translation in order to make the case that it's forbidden to elect this person. And then he tried to defend himself against this and say, like, don't fall for people who are toying around with the Quran and whatever. And then this earned him a blasphemy trial, and he was sentenced to a prison term for blasphemy, and he lost the election, etc. And what you can see in a lot of statements and social media memes, etc., is that people were taking this translation of the Quran to be the meaning of the Quran. So they were completely buying into the invisible translator paradigm. They didn't see the voice of the translator or hear it. They just saw this as the Quran. And for example, in the picture on the right, you can see that the question is asked, are these 16 Qurans, and they are just random Quran editions you could buy in bookstores, are they false? And this is simply because they were using a newer edition, like a more recent edition of the ministry translation that didn't translate the Arabic term awliya as leaders, but as close friends, which is actually internationally, if you look beyond Indonesia, a much more common translation. So it's not really an issue of falsification. It's a different understanding of the term. And it's not as if the term leaders is in any way a unanimous term in Quranic exegesis or anything, but still people were just looking at the translation. And so, yeah, this is a problem I see with the invisible translator paradigm. If it's so pervasive that people think that the translation is automatically giving us the correct and the one and only correct meaning. And the next step, I think, from this whole thought process on the Quran and its translation would be to ask whether these new, like these rediscovered ways of translating the Quran that we are slowly seeing, like interlinear translations and so on, couldn't also be enriching to European textual traditions and text production. So it doesn't just have to be something that Muslims are doing who want to revive some historical traditions and so on. It could also be helpful to Europeans to just diversify. I mean, I'm not arguing that the invisible translator paradigm should be abolished. As I said, it has its uses, but diversification is often a good thing, and it also would give people more sensitivity for what a translation is actually doing. I will end it here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Johanna. I didn't find the applause button, so I give my applause like that. Thanks a lot for this really rich presentation. So it was such a lot of fascinating aspects and facts as well. So where to start? I have a lot of questions. I just will put one, and then maybe the others will get in the discussion. In Christianism, mainly in the Catholic Church, the translation of the Holy Bible has been from the beginning a highly debated enterprise, and it even sometimes in some contexts it was formally forbidden. And to simplify the reason, nobody is entitled to paraphrase the word of God by a human voice or a human script. So and the translation to modern vernacular languages, as by Martin Luther, Jean Calvin, was an act of highly political and theological significance, and of theological and political dissidence even to the spiritual establishment. So my first question would be, do we have a similar discussion around translations of the Quran? And then the second question is to return more to your talk and to the for example, take this Al-Ibri's example. It seems clear to me that the aim of this Al-Ibri's, which is a manual for young students, you mentioned the yellow color and so on. So what seems to me, this is a work which is meant to enable students to read the original. It's not to make them understand, or to make them understand, but at the base of the original word. So maybe this is related to my first question, that they don't, translating the Quran does not mean that it's the Arabic version which will still be the only real version. That's what you seem to say at the end.
Yeah, okay, so I didn't want to go into too much detail of the history of the Quran and so on, but obviously, yeah. And yeah, first of all, the Bible translation thing, well, this is interesting because the whole debate in Catholicism actually revolved around a translation, the Vulgata, which is not actually the original text of the Bible, but it's a translation. And this translation was gaining like quasi-sacred status, and people were not allowed to translate it into other vernacular languages, which also implied a certain prestige of Latin versus other languages, but also the role of clerics versus non-clerics, etc. I think it's very hard to translate Muslim, to compare Muslim debates with this, because the situation in Islam is all in all more comparable with Judaism, in that the relevance of the actual original source text has never gone away. So in the beginnings of Islam, there was a legal debate about whether you could, for example, so in every ritual prayer, you have to recite some verses of the Quran, and they are recited in Arabic. So even if Muslims don't know Arabic, they are supposed to learn these verses, just memorize them. And there was a debate about whether Muslims could recite these verses in other languages. For example, if they had only just embraced Islam and had actually not been able to memorize these verses, and the majority of scholars said no, the recitation, the prayer always has to be in Arabic. And this has remained the case basically for the vast majority of Muslims until today. They consider the Arabic Quran the authentic word of God. And so in its written form, in its spoken form, it's sacred, and it can't be replaced by anything else. So this is the first premise. But precisely because of this premise, for a long time, there wasn't really a big argument over translating the Quran, because it was always clear to everyone that these translations were not meant to replace the Arabic Quran. They were just meant to make it more comprehensible to people. And that's why you find these traditional formats always referring back to the Arabic Quran and ultimately enabling people to understand it. But even then, Al-Ibriz, for example, it has this paraphrastic translation, or what I called this, that's what I called it. And it is comprehensible by itself, even by children who don't understand the Arabic. So he is trying to give the meaning in a way that's understandable and for his audience. So we always have this as well, also in popular preaching and so on, because I mean, today 80% of Muslims are not native speakers of Arabic, and historically, for most of the time, it was a bit similar. We did have a big debate emerging in the early 20th century as a reaction to the intrusion of the invisible translator paradigm, because then a lot of scholars were afraid of several things. First of all, a loss of, like in Catholicism, a loss of their own status and role as mediators of the meaning of the Quran towards ordinary Muslims. It was never a formalized role. There was never an interdiction against reading the Quran for ordinary people, but it was the traditional social role that the scholars had. And obviously, a lot of them didn't want to lose it. So a lot of them made this argument that you shouldn't translate the Quran, you should leave it to scholars to explain its meaning to people. Then there was nationalism. A lot of the debates on Quran translations were tied to nationalism, for example, in the Ottoman Empire, as it was in the process of becoming Turkey. There were a lot of nationalists who thought we need a Turkish Quran. And then very clearly the idea of these nationalists was we need it actually for recitation, for calling people to prayer and so on. And a lot of devout Muslims didn't want that. So yeah, these were some of the contexts, a lot of other reasons, but these were some of the contexts in which this debate erupted, especially in the Ottoman regions, Egypt and so on. And it ended mostly with the success of Quran translations in this modern form. But very often there was a kind of formulaic compromise because people would translate the Quran and they would simply not call it a translation, but they would say the approximate meanings of the verses of the Holy Quran or something. So we have a lot of Muslim produced translations that have super convoluted titles like this. And the reason is nobody wants to say like this is a translation and it's the equivalent of the Arabic Quran, because there cannot be such a thing as the equivalent to the word of God written by a human. It's just not possible. So yeah, this is basically, I think, the answer to your second question.
Yeah, if there are, for the moment, there are no questions. Let me put another thing. What about these oral traditions of communication of the Quran you mentioned for West Africa? I remember. Do we know about them? You said that there was a way of oral transmission of Quran or reciting of reciting the Quran. Do we know about the variants of these texts? Was it very fixed, or is it a variant text? Or what about that?
It wasn't really fixed. I mean, people were listening to it because of the individual scholar who was doing this. So they wanted to actually listen to the scholar and not just to the Quran. And usually there was a Quran reciter and then there was a scholar giving the meaning. And of course, the problem with oral traditions is that they are very hard to grasp. So we can try to construct something from anthropological evidence that maybe goes back to the early 20th century or something, from like some manuscripts that clearly indicate that they are based on an oral format, maybe written down by students of a teacher, or marginal remarks in a Quran manuscript that indicate that somebody was teaching this and so on. And this gives a kind of impression that there is some kind of continuity in exegetical traditions. We also know that there's one Quranic commentary in Arabic that has really been taught from the Malay archipelago to West Africa. It comes from the 15th century Egypt, the Tafsir al-Jalalain. It's very short, very, very, very brief explanations of the Quran. So it was ideal for students, and it informed much of the dominant interpretations that were given in these regions, but not necessarily to the extent that it was like always the same, or that it wouldn't matter at all who was doing the translation. So there was still some variety. Yeah, and there was also always a lot of emphasis on teaching the Arabic Quran first and foremost. And then, for example, in West Africa, it became increasingly common for preachers to have Quran interpretation sessions in Ramadan. So people could come every day and listen to one portion of the Quran recited and explained. And it was like really long sessions, because if you divide the Quran into 30 sections, it's still a lot of text for one day, especially if you have the recitation and an explanation. But this was like hugely popular, but it's also, to a certain extent, it's a bit hard to say how much of this is a popular, like a modern phenomenon that also came alongside Islamic revivalism, where the Quran tended to get a more important and more central role, and to what extent it has always been done, or like always, not obviously not always, but like 500 years ago or something.